information you need is there, and you'll get an email today.
Oh, okay.
Good morning. Good morning,
Roger,
Dennis
Robert.
and Josh.
Anything
How are
in
you?
person?
Morning, Robert.
Is there anything in person?
Yes?
Okay.
Dennis, you want to give it another?
Sorry?
You want to give it another minute, or should we start?
Wait a minute, someone just came in here. Okay. Oh, yeah, we can start, I think. People will be popping in and out. I made you co-host, so if you catch it before I do.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. Well, we're at 18. That's not bad.
So where do we start?
So today, we're going
let's go to the beginning.
Oh, yeah, the beginning. We're actually going to go to the beginning text. We originally, when Josh and I were talking, we talked about original sin based on the fall. But really, before you even get to the concept of sin, you've got to talk about the concept of grace and creation. The first one of our kind as given in the creation story. So we need to begin there. And so we're going to do that with that whole, basically the creation of humankind. We're not going to go through each one of the days because the pinnacle of that creation is supposed to be the creation of Adam and then Eve. Where do you want to be? You want me to read my text and then you read yours, or what?
Maybe we should start with what Adam means. I think that's probably an important thing for us to understand, because normally, you have a buddy named Adam. I've got a couple friends named Adam, except really to understand that this first human being wasn't named Adam. Adam actually means something that's integral for us to understand who he is. He's not called Adam. In Hebrew, he's called, or you might say Adam, which means man, but he's called Ha-Adam, the man. And Adam actually comes from the same root as Adamah, which means the ground. So in fact, some translations of the text don't translate it as Adam or the man, they translate it as the earthling. That is the person who comes from the earth. I'm just trying to think of another way to put it. In Hebrew, the color red is called Edom, because it's the brownish red that is the ground. So I just want to be clear that this person that we're talking about is literally the earthling, the person who comes from the earth. Adam is kind of the name that we've given to him in later generations, but when texts refer to the man or the first person or Adam, we're referring to this concept of someone who comes from earth, or we might also use some other terms for him today. I think we're going to use the term primordial man. Is that one that Christianity adopts as well?
Well, we refer to it as that. I mean, the whole aspect of it's from the earth that we arise. I mean, that's why I love, as I mentioned last week, kind of as a segue, but I loved the image of James Weldon Johnson when he, in his book of poems called God's Trombones, when he takes some of the Old Testament or Hebrew Testament stories, and he does this one. I mean, he talks about, and there the great God Almighty, like a mammy bending over her baby, knelt down in the dirt, and scooped up clay and made it into humankind, and then blew into it the breath, the ruach, the breath of life. That whole image of scooping up the clay, scooping up, and God as the potter in a way. I know that's mainly Isaiah, but as the potter forming the humankind out of that.
Yeah, I think that metaphor actually works almost, well, it's a metaphor there, but it's actually very physical in terms of what's happening and literally what's being described. Should we go to the text?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Here wait, is that the right one? Yes. Okay. Let's take a look. I know not all of you speak Hebrew, and we're going to focus primarily on the English, but there might be a couple Hebrew words I might explain which might be helpful. So maybe I'll start out by reading the Hebrew, and then Dennis, you pick a translation.
Okay, I'm
Genesis
gonna be
1:20.
muting some people here.
And maybe what we should do is default mute everybody just to keep the background noise down, and then when people want to unmute themselves, they can.
Just press the space bar.
Yep. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tsalmo, b'tselem Elohim bara oto zachar u'benekeva, or u'nekeva bara otam. Dennis, the translation?
Okay, God created human beings. He created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female.
All right, what do we learn about the nature of Adam, of humankind, of humanity here from this text? This is a pretty important text in the Bible. Now you can raise your hands and unmute yourselves.
He
Tony, go ahead.
He created them godlike, and also he created them male and female, so none of this with the rib from Adam.
So you point out something that's incredibly important, which is there's a creation here of both male and female, but Eve is not created until Genesis 2. So what's going on? You're going to ask a scholar will tell you there's actually two different Genesis narratives. In the first Genesis narrative, it's the 7 days of creation. In the second Genesis narrative, it's recreating all the things that are going on or that were created in day one. It's just giving you an alternative view on the creation story, or maybe a different perspective on it. But actually, this is going to give way to a number of different interpretations about what the nature of Ha'adam, Adam, actually is. The Hebrew, you can hear it, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. It could just say God created Adam in his image. Here the translations are human beings and man in his image. But we learn that God created them, male and female.
Well, Michael had raised something in a little chat on the side of a godlike question mark. As I mentioned, this is more of a paraphrase than it is a literal translation. What tends to happen in most of the English translations that we use is that in God's image, he made him in God's light, in the likeness of God, he was made. So that image, the two words image and likeness become key, at least in Christian theology as it develops. So this particular translation uses godlike, but and God created man in his image. In his likeness, God created him, male and female, he created them. So it's a play on both the word image and likeness.
Yeah, I like the idea that God then has both male and female qualities.
Sure.
God's likeness has both male and female qualities. We discussed that a little bit last week, I think, when we talked about the feminine aspects of God being a rather comforting aspect of God. And that existed both in Judaism and Christianity, I believe, with Mary.
Or just the ruach. Isn't ruach feminine?
It might be.
Kind of.
No, actually, ruach is masculine. It happens to be, but there's other feminine images of God. Clearly, one is called that we even call it Shekhinah, which means God's dwelling place.
Okay.
We used to describe God's comfort that comes down and shields you. But God clearly here has both.
Bernie's waving his hands there. Get unmute yourself, Bernie.
How do I do that?
You just did it. Press the space bar and you can talk.
You're unmuted, Bernie. We can hear you.
Yeah, I just pressed the space bar.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, explain to me, since we're in the beginning, why is Elohim in the plural?
Bernie wants to lead us down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but it is important to note that the name that we have for God here is called Elohim, which is a plural name for God. It means, if you were to translate it literally, it would mean gods. It's a name that encompasses a chorus of different gods, perhaps, if you were to look at it anthropologically. But I want to leave it at that for now, and perhaps some other time we could explore it further. But this session, we're focusing on Adam and not necessarily God. We're focusing on
Okay, I give up.
not God to be human-like. So, you know, I do that sometimes. I try to bring us back, and I try not to take the bait to take us down into off the topic. So forgive me, but I'm going to keep us a little bit on the track here.
It can also just be the different aspects of God. It doesn't have to be gods. It is the different aspects of God.
That works too.
That doesn't make sense.
All right, so here we have, as Denis said, the likeness, or the tselem. Tselem in Hebrew is an image of God. We like to say that we are created in God's image. And now the question is, what does that mean? It seems like an easy concept. Oh yeah, we look just like God. God must be human. Well, okay. Or maybe God must have our physical features. God has a head, God has a nose, God has hands, as we see throughout the text. Maybe that's what it means.
Yeah, but that doesn't make sense.
Of course not. So what does it mean?
Because when Moses asked to see him, you can't see him because no man can see him and live. So he shows him his
backside. Yeah, so let me ask the question then a little bit differently. If it doesn't mean that God has anthropomorphic human features, what does being created in the likeness or the image of God actually mean? I just want to share with you one incredibly important text that's not going to give anything away. I'm going to scroll down one second. It's a text from the Jerusalem Talmud. So a text from about 600 of the Common Era. Let's see, where did I put it? I think it's right over. Here it is. Rabbi Akiva teaches, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the major principle of the Torah. Okay, that's actually a pretty good principle of the Torah. In fact, I think Jesus might also quote that as well in terms of what's the major founding principle of Jewish law or of law in general, or how to be a good Christian or how to be, but that's Rabbi Akiva. Then Ben Azai says, the major thing is this line from, this is Genesis 5:1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And by the way, it's going to re-quote what we just learned in Genesis 1. And the day that God created man, in the likeness of God, he created him. That's the major principle that he wants you to know. This is an even greater principle, he says, because it encompasses the other. So what does being created in God's image have to do with loving your neighbor as yourself? And what does it have to do with something that guides everyday Jewish practice or everyday Christian practice or everyday ethical living?
In part of what mine is in the blue, but to kind of go along with that, some of the early church writers, when we're getting back, it's going to be a little higher than that.
I might have moved.
You might have moved it.
Give me a keyword.
I'll
search for it.
Higher. No, yeah. Keep going back. Keep going backwards like that.
Could you clarify what's meant by he, him? He being Adam, him being God? Or is one morphing into the other?
When it says, essentially, anytime you see a capital H, other than it's at the beginning of the sentence, the translator is going to try to give you a little hint that we're talking about.
That's the divine.
Yeah.
It's the divine one.
But remember, as we learned before, and there's a slight difference in the repetition from Genesis 5 to Genesis 1. Genesis 5 says that in God's image, God created him. Genesis 1 says, in God's image, God created them, male and female, God created them. So there's a slight twist in it. But also, whenever there's a gender uncertainty, if you were to talk about in Hebrew, there's an expression in biblical Hebrew, it says kol ish. It means every single man. It actually doesn't mean every single man. It means every single person, gender neutral. All of humanity, kol ish. So, a lot of the times, because Hebrew is a gendered language, it gets interpreted that it's referring specifically only to males, where in fact the context tells you, in fact, there's a line in Torah that says, kol ish, and then it goes on to list, tapchem nashechem, every man, and then it says women and children included in the list. So clearly it's not referring to necessarily a limit in gender, it's referring to everybody. And it's why the message actually, I think, more aptly translates it as God created human beings, he created them godlike, and it's trying to take out Adam as humanity and not just
giving it the male gender. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's all humanity versus just one individual.
We also use the word mankind, and it has been changed relatively recently to humankind.
Yeah.
It's just, it's inclusive.
Yes.
Right.
I want to get to the text that you're looking for. Tell me
It's right after, this is the family tree of human race that you had. This is the record of Adam's line. It's up higher. No, the other way. I don't know how we can share control of this.
Maybe I didn't. Maybe I've got to re-include it. I might not have put it in. I thought you put that back in. Give me 1 second. Dennis, why don't you start talking about it? And in 30 seconds, it'll be up on the screen.
For us, when we talk about that image of God, central to our Christian understanding of human nature is that Genesis 1:27 that we just looked at, which speaks of humanity being made in God's image and likeness. It's an idea that's expressed in early writing as the imago Dei, the image of God, God's image. It's especially key in the early patristic period, the 150 to about 300, where there's no distinction drawn between the two phrases of image of God and the likeness of God. Yeah, it's right there, right down there, right in here there. Okay. So Tertullian retained the image of God even after sinning. Humanity retains that image of God even after the fall. But at the very beginning, what's key for us is that it's our human nature which reflects something of God's character, whether that's the character of love, but it's about human nature. And human nature's propensity to have to be in relationship. And so relationship with God, with the divine, is part of that likeness of God. So that relationship aspect becomes key in the Christian context for us. A little further down, Josh, right there, Lactantius, who's writing in the 300s. He argues that being created in the image of God established the common identity and dignity of all human beings, leading directly to a series of what they would call political doctrines, not as we do it today, concerning rights and responsibilities of human. I've spoken, he says, about what is due to God. Now I speak about what is due to people, since that equally still relates to God, since humanity is the image of God. The strongest bond which unites us is humanity. Anyone who breaks it is a criminal and parricide. Now it was from the one human being that God created us all, so that we are all of the same blood, with the result that the greatest crime is to hate humanity or to do them harm. That is why we are forbidden to develop or to encourage hatred. So if we are the work of the same God, what else are we but brothers and sisters? The bond which unites our souls is therefore stronger than that which unites our bodies.
Dennis, I've said in the past that sometimes this class is going to be about sharing our differences and how our interpretations are radically different. Well, it's almost as if, how do you pronounce his name?
Lactantius.
Lactantius. It's almost as if he studied the Talmud. Because
Probably
we have almost the exact same text in the Talmud. Hold on, I have it right over here. I just want to share this with you because it's so eerily similar. It's a very famous text in the Talmud. So let's keep going down. Here we go. The Talmud is discussing an instance of capital punishment, and they're trying to say why it's so important that you get it right with capital punishment, and why your witnesses need to be made sure, it needs to be known to them about the stakes at what's going on. It says, therefore, Adam was first created alone, to teach you that with regard to anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people, and by the way, this is also a mistranslation. It should be destroys any life, kol ish. The verse describes him as if he's destroyed an entire world. As Adam was one person from whom the population of an entire world came forth. And conversely, anyone who sustains one's soul, period, the verse describes to him as it's as if he's sustained an entire world. Now the next example that they cite, why was Adam created first alone? And it was done due to the importance of maintaining peace among people. And here's where it gets really similar. So that one person will not say to another, my father, my progenitor is greater than your father. And it was also so that heretics who believe in multiple gods will not say there are many authorities in heaven, and each created a different person. I love the line here, in order to keep peace among people so that no person will say to another, my father is greater than your father. And you might actually say that with religion as well. Why was Adam created? Why is Adam our shared ancestor? In order to teach that one religion, one type of people is not greater than the next. Right. We all share the same common ancestor. Why was the world not created with with Abraham? Well, Abraham might be the creator of faith, you might say. But Adam is the creator of the common bond that links people who also don't even have faith. I think that's an important thing. Even people who don't have faith, we still treat them as if they are created in God's image.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sal.
Can we go back to the very top of your written material, the first sentence?
The creation story, 127?
Yes, 127.
Should be there.
Okay.
Yeah, here, I'm still here. Okay, what I find more difficult to unpack is not God creating them in his image, but saying here, he created them God-like. How would you unpack that? What is meant by God-like?
Again, that's the message one. I think that what he's trying to get at with the verse in like the Revised Standard Version or the newly revised Standard Version would say, God created humankind. He created them in his image, in his likeness, he created them.
Yeah, it's a repetition of the Hebrew word, tselem. Tselem in Hebrew means image. So I'll read you the Hebrew just so you can kind of get a flavor of how it sounds. Bit salmo, bit tselem Elohim bara oto. It's almost poetic, but it really is, it would probably be more apt if you're translating it very literally to translate it as God created Adam in God's image. In God's image, God created them. Actually, it's him here, and then male and female, he created them. Yeah. So that word image appears over and over again. And I think, likeness is certainly a nice synonym for image. And I think the translation is just trying to mix up the word choice to give it a little extra flavor.
Word?
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Oh, yeah. So godlike in the sense that it's God's inspiring breath that animates the clay. Mm-hmm. And so it's the Holy Spirit that gives us life. Right. And that's that we partake of the divine. So not independent of any images of God, anthropomorphizing or gender-wise, but it's the Spirit that's the common bond.
Right.
As opposed to the progenitor literally descending from Adam, but the Spirit that's passed down as well.
Good. No, I like that, David. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's another hand, I think, before we move on. No? Tony, go ahead.
If if only one person was created, if only it was Adam, so that there would be no jealousy or, rivalry between, my father's better than your father, but we're created in God's image. So God created us with all of these, I don't know if fault is the right word, but all of these different attributes that we would be competitive.
For me, that gets to the fall. We're not there yet. It's not autumn fall, but to the negating of that. Here, and what I like about this first verse also is that he created the male and female. It talks about that essence that we just talked about with Lactantius, says that it automatically puts it in relationship, not waiting around for Eve to show up, but already what the divine one is talking about in this, or the author of Genesis saying, is that we were already created for relationship. And so by creating and reflecting God's nature, he created them, is saying there's already relationship.
There's another metaphor that's used in among the rabbis. They say God is kind of like a minter, except when a normal human minter mints coins, every single coin looks alike and it's got a template, right? The template, and you repeat it over and over again, and every single coin is the same. It says when God
had to have created both male and female to have procreation.
Yeah, so let me finish the metaphor though. So when God is the minter, creates humankind, what God does, God's template is essentially Adam, but every single face that God creates is different. So essentially every coin looks different, even though it has the same archetype. I think that's an important understanding. It says a couple things, which is no matter what you look like and no matter what attributes you have, they're essentially minted from an idea that is God. God is an all. So it's hard to say that to accuse someone of not acting godlike, because God's got all attributes, not just the attributes in which you favor. And each person is different, and in their differences, they're still godlike. I think that's an important thing that we've got to remember. There's not a mold that we're trying to be more like. In fact, being more like yourself is being more like the original mint from which you came and being more like God.
One of our present-day commentators, Dominic Crossan, likes to refer to, he says, this is like the original blessing that we're talking about at this point. The blessing being a gift, the original grace. Yes, he's counteracting Augustine, who writes a little later, but this whole point is that God's word, when humankind is made, is not that it's good, but that it's very good. There's almost a pleasure in the divine at the creation of humankind. And I think that what the author at this point is really setting us up for that, is looking for this original blessing, this original atmosphere that we're in, with God blowing into the nostrils the breath of life. And we become a living soul. Sorry. I have to put myself on mute for this one.
The Messiah is always good background.
Let me, I might transition us a little bit, and hopefully Dennis won't get angry at me, but I do want to transfer a little bit to a different idea which comes from these early texts as well, which is essentially if what was created along with Adam, depending on which interpretation, and here's where Judaism and Christianity are going to differ. I'll start with Judaism essentially, is when is sin created? And when is our inclination to sin created? So far we have with Adam, some kind of being that's created and more or less everything is perfect. In fact, Adam is placed in this garden, and the garden seems to be a model of perfection. I mean, even now when we say, oh, I'm going to Eden, Eden is a model of where you go when things are really good, when the world looks completely perfect. So according to, I guess, both Jewish and Christian texts, Hold on, let's just mute Bernie for a second. Doesn't realize he's unmuted. Sin did not exist in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing that I think we would agree on. Now, the place where we're going to diverge is at what point does sin become a part of the essence of human character? Should we start with Judy? I think, should we start Jewishly or Christianly, or through Christianity, Dennis?
So I just want to apologize. That was West Hampton Care Center. I have an aunt that's there, and they were updating me on medicine for her. So sorry about that.
We sure will. Yeah.
God bless her. She's 94. She's been through COVID twice, and I said she's going to bury me.
No.
That's the way it is. So I think that when we begin to, I think that's important that we look at this as, I think that this is the author of Genesis is setting up that original blessing, that original place, that place where there is nothing wrong.
Yeah, in fact, just a quick word on language. Does anyone know what Eden means?
Eden.
No. What does it mean? It means absolute delight.
But I think that's great, because that's exactly the conveyance of the image of God at the creation of humankind is really one of absolute delight. So it has to be the garden of absolute delight, because that's where we're placed. God is showing this happiness. Indeed, this is very good.
Good.
I think that's a great image.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dennis.
Okay. So where are we going now?
Are we going to sin? When was sin created in Christianity?
In the 3rd chapter, actually.
I can get there for us, even though I don't know. Oh, here we go. Right here.
In the 3rd chapter. And this is the text that becomes controversial even in Christianity, because it's not at the very beginning, in the sense of, we see this is where, quote unquote, sin comes into play. Augustine in the mid-400s will say this is the passage that brings us original sin that is conveyed throughout. But in the early church, that wasn't a mark that they would not have agreed with Augustine. Let me put it that way. So now the serpent was clever, more clever than any wild animal God had made. He spoke to the woman, "Do I understand that God told you not to eat from any tree in the garden?" She said to the serpent, "Well, not at all. We can eat from the trees in the garden. Let me get this one here. It's only about the tree in the middle of the garden that God said don't eat from it. Don't even touch it or you'll die." The serpent said to the woman, "You won't die. God knows that the moment you eat from the tree, you'll see what's really going on. You'll be just like God, knowing everything, ranging all the way from good to evil."
Do I need to bring up the fuller text?
I don't know, how far did you want to go down?
That's how far I put, but we can go down farther?
Let's go a little further on that. Let's get the whole story in.
All right, give me 1 second and I'm going to bring it up on the screen. Just got to reopen a new document. Genesis 3. Okay, coming back up, but I might not have. Do you want the message? Let me get you the message.
It's okay. I have this one here if we need.
Here we are. Give me 1 sec. Let's share the screen. There we go.
Okay.
Verse 6.
So when the woman saw that the tree looked like good eating and realized what she would get out of it, she'd know everything. She took and ate the fruit and then gave some to her husband, and he ate. Immediately the two of them did see what was really going on. They saw themselves naked. They sewed fig leaves together as makeshift clothes for themselves. When they heard the sound of God strolling in the garden in the evening breeze, the man and his wife hid in the trees of the garden. They hid from God. God called out, "Where are you?" I heard you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Who told you you were naked? Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? Well, the woman gave me as a companion. She gave me a fruit from the tree, and yes, I ate it. What is this that you've done? Well, the serpent seduced me, and I ate it. I'd leave it there.
Okay.
In the NRSV, how they translate that 6 verses. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, playing on that Eden word, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took the fruit and ate. So that's basic. So that's in the Christian tradition. That's what we're going to say is that's the origin of sin. That is the original sin. Not that they ate a piece of fruit, but that they wanted to be equal to God. Or as some of the early Christian writers would say, is they became involved in the material world and not the spiritual world. The seduction was the material world, and a lust for power, a lust for a greed for more than what they had. And that becomes the original sin. Not that it was passed down unto all generations. There are some hints of it in there, but that's what Augustine will say in the 400s, but the early writers didn't claim that at this point.
Now, Judaism doesn't necessarily see this as the paradigm for sin. And I think that's an important distinction between the way that we understand the text. One of the things that I always teach about is I actually see the serpent or the snake as a paradigm in the way that we read Scripture as a paradigm for doubt, not for sin. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. One, it's not clear what Eve does wrong. I guess she eats from the tree that she's not supposed to eat, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Wouldn't you think that's a tree of blessing? But what I think the snake symbolizes is actually something that's slightly different. And I want to go to a different text to show you what I mean. I'm going to go to, let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Exodus 4. So this is when God is speaking to Moses at the bush, right? And Moses speaks up and says, what if they don't believe me and they don't listen to me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you? God said to him, what is in your hand? He replied, a rod. He said, cast it to the ground. And he casts it to the ground and it becomes a snake. Same word for snake, by the way. And Moses recoiled from it. And then the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and grasp it by its tail. He put out his hand, seized it, and it became a rod in its hand. Okay, there's a giant metaphor that's going on here. First thing you should know about snake handling 101, and I don't like snakes, but I do know that you never pick a snake up by its tail, right? Why not? Because it's going to go back and bite you, but that's precisely what God is asking him to do. What's Moses' problem here? He is uncertain about himself. He has doubt. He has a fear that they're not going to believe me. They're not going to listen to me. Moses questions not just himself, but he's questioning God. And so what does God have him do? He has him essentially manifest his doubt in a very physical form. A snake. And what do? Grab the doubt by its tail, hold it up until it becomes solid, until you're able to understand it and see it and conquer it. And that's essentially what happens. I think you apply that same paradigm to understanding, or at least I think the Jewish tradition does, that when you go back to Genesis and you look at this text, the snake here seems to be the snake who plants doubt.
Whispers doubt, right.
Yeah, but this isn't our marker of where sin originates. Sin actually seems to originate a little bit later in the text, not too much farther in Genesis. It actually seems to originate for us, and what the rabbis are going to pick up on, is in Noah's generation. This is my translation here. Adonai, or God, saw that the evil, the Ra of humanity, was great in the land, And every inclination, and the word is yetzer, that's going to become important, of the thoughts of his or her heart was evil every single day. This seems to be the first place where, not where you have some kind of crime, because by the way, before this we had Cain and Abel, but this seems to be the place where we have humanity becoming inherently evil. And you have actually something that happens right after the flood in the Noah story. God said in his heart, I will not continue to curse you, for I know that the heart of humanity is evil from youth. Now, there's
that youth be from the very beginning of creation.
So Christianity might say, oh, from youth, from the beginning of creation. Judaism is going to take a little bit more literally, which is that at our point of birth, a sign of maturity that we have essentially is that we have a proclivity to sinning. Or what they're going to call it in Hebrew is the yetzer hara. I like to translate the yetzer hara. Literally, it means the evil inclination, but more idiomatically, in the way that it's described, it's going to be your primal inclination, which is your behavior and your thoughts that are animalistic. By the way, the opposite of that, your higher level thoughts, are precisely what makes you created in the image of God. That is, you have both your animalistic thoughts, and then you have your moral and ethical thoughts. You have the law, and that is precisely, again, what makes you godlike. Your higher level understanding of the world, your goodness. But we're actually going to see even Rashi, who was a famous medieval commentator in the 11th century in France. Rashi says, from the moment that one stirs to exit the womb of one's mother, the yetzer hara is placed within him. So essentially, it's something that we acquire from birth. But the interesting thing, and it might be a small nuanced distinction, is that sin is not inherited from generation to generation. It essentially is a part of the developmental process, even if it is from birth. And I think that's one really important note of distinction between Christianity. We're not necessarily inheriting sin from Adam. It's simply a part of the maturity process that makes us human. Judaism doesn't have original sin. Judaism doesn't have inherited sin, even though a concept does appear later where the sins of your father are passed down to the children unto the 1000th generation. That seems to be not necessarily about inheriting the idea of the quality of sin, but it seems to be about you're punished for the sins of your father, not necessarily sin being inherited as a whole. I saw a couple hands. Let's start with Sal, and I saw Marjorie, David, and Tony.
Okay. As Dennis pointed out, Augustine was the first to postulate this idea of original sin in the late 4th century. And it was not part of the Christian faith prior to that, although a reference has been made to Paul about, in letter to Romans, stating about what they claim was his reference to original sin. However, Eve and Adam disobeyed God's directive, commandment, instruction. How could they then have not been considered to have sinned?
So the question is, what is sin in general? And I think we've got to define that, because we're using an English lexicon to define something that has theological implications.
For us, sin, it's not just, it's missing the mark of what's been impressed upon us as the original blessing. So we would say the sin is seeking something which is self-centered and not other-centered. Adam and Eve choose to do something that is self-centered. They want to be equal to God. They want to know all of the good and all of the evil. So therefore, by choosing that, they've become more self-centered, self-interested, and therefore broke the command, that relationship. I'm going to say command. They broke that relationship of trusting in God, that God would maintain their delight in that relationship. When they chose to expand that relationship into self-centeredness, that we would say is the sin. That's the breakdown of that relationship. It's the first thing that goes wrong in the relationship, because what happens after that is what? They can't stay in the Garden of Delight. They've got to go. They get kicked out. Eve is told. I mean, when you just read that one rabbi from southern France in the 11th century, you know, it's out of the womb of the mother. And in the passage in Genesis, he says to Eve, you're going to have that struggle in birth, and it's going to be painful because of what you've done.
But God planted the tree to begin with. For whom did he plant it?
That's a good question. Now we're talking about, did God really, if God has omniscience and God knows everything, wouldn't, I mean, then we're going to get into free will, right? Which might take us a little bit astray. Let me just say, I actually think
that fruit.
I think that Judaism has a very similar view on sin, and the word that is used in Hebrew quite often is the word chet, which quite literally is the same word that's used for archery, when you shoot a bow and arrow and you don't hit the bullseye. And that's what I think the metaphor actually is.
We our theological word would be from Greek hamartia, which is to miss the mark.
And so literally you're not hitting the mark. An example of that is you're walking down the street and you see a guy who is asking for money and you don't give charity to him. Did you actually transgress the law? Well, you didn't actually, you had chet, you missed the mark. You were supposed to give to him. But there's another word that we have, and the word is avera. And avera means transgress. It means you go over the line. Murder is avera. It's not a sin. You don't miss the mark when you murder someone. You're quite literally...
You hit the mark.
Yeah, but the wrong mark.
But I'm confused here. According to Jewish interpretation of Genesis, sin did not come into the world until the time of Noah?
So what my point is that what goes on, the way that sin is a part of the human experience doesn't seem to be necessarily part of, and by the way, when I say sin, yeah, you could say that it does, but I think we're not, and I'm sorry I'm being ambiguous here. Judaism doesn't see Adam as the model for sinning. It sees Adam as really the model of giving into temptation. It sees Adam as the model of curiosity. It sees Adam as the model of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which, by the way, might have necessarily connotations of blessing, but it's not a marker of where humanity failed. It's a marker of where humanity evolved. And it did evolve, yes, you can say, through disobeying God's law, but you really actually see the model for what it means to sin come in Noah, not in Adam. So let's go down that, and I hope
there were several questions there. Marjorie, David. Okay, David. Unmute yourself. You got to unmute yourself, David.
I can hear you.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So the sexual interpretation of eating the apple, that's essential in Rabbi Nachman, and he says you have to celebrate the divine, you have to have sexual transcendence. So I submit that the guilt and the shame that separate us from sexual pleasure and procreation, that guilt is part of the sin, guilt and shame, as opposed to the chassid being close to God through orgasm. And it's all the lower sephirot and the higher ones simultaneously, the spirit and the flesh, not separating the two, as the chassid puts a belt around his waist to signify separating the lower and the upper. We want to be whole, up and down, material and spiritual at the same time. But I think our evil, our destructiveness is not of a sexual nature. It's something more destructive, hardwired, thanatos, the catabolism of our body that kills us cells and brings us back to the inanimate. The goal of life being death is a journey, and that destructiveness is part of it, wired in surely as our metabolism that gives us life and our holy spark that we celebrate. And being like God, I don't see anything wrong wanting to be like God. It's an aspiration. Assuming we're God, that's different. That's hubris. But the wish to be godlike is a nice, inspiring aspiration.
I think where we're definitely would is that it was hubris on their part, not just aspiring to be God-like, but to be God.
Right. That's
that ultimately that's the temptation of the deceiver, of Satan in this case, is that he just doesn't want you to be equal to him. Go on, just go for it. And that's what they give into, and ultimately to replace God. What we would say is that God was not enough for them. They wanted to be. There was an equality being sought in the temptation.
Thank you.
And that's where in our Christian tradition we're saying is that that's what we inherit in human nature. That's ultimately what Augustine would argue as original sin. But what the early writers would say is, in that going wrong, Adam and Eve were created in the image of God, meant that they were free from normal weaknesses and disabilities, which subsequently afflicted human nature, such as death. One of the early Greek writers, good old Cyril of Jerusalem, emphasizes there was no need for Adam or Eve to fall from that state of blessedness or goodness. It took place as a result of their decision to turn away from God, to be equal to him and to the material world. It took place as a result, the image of God in human nature was defaced, was disfigured. And that's how humanity, tracing its roots back to Adam and Eve, he argues, follows that all humanity shares in that defacement of the image of God, because we have that desire to replace God or to be God.
I'll drink to megalomania in small doses.
As long as it's single malt.
All right, Tony.
If this is the creation story and Adam and Eve, and God plants the tree of knowledge of good and evil, why did he even have evil at all to begin with in creation?
Well, there's a good question there, and I want to bring you to a text that I actually did include. It's an interpretation of what we're going to call the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara means evil inclination. Yetzer Hatov means good inclination. The reason why those are such misnomers is that, of course, you would think, oh, evil inclination is bad. But this is actually another example of where it doesn't mean evil. It means primal, animalistic inclination. And good inclination doesn't necessarily just mean good. It means more, I would actually say, godlike inclinations or moral and ethical inclinations. So when you read this text about is our primal inclination good, Rabbi Nachman bar Shmuel bar Nachman says in the name of another rabbi, Shmuel bar Nachman, here it is very good. So when the text says that Adam was created very good, this is the good inclination. And there it also says very good. This is what they're going to say, they're going to interpret as the evil inclination. And the evil inclination is very good? I'm astounded, says the rabbi. How can the evil inclination be very good? And he responds, were it not for the evil inclination, a man would not build a house or marry a woman or beget nor engage in business. And similarly, in the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, it says, it is the rivalry of each against his fellow that is good. Essentially, the essence is if you don't have an animalistic inclination, you don't have some of the basic fundamental building blocks of civilization. And let alone civilization, you don't have some of the basic fundamental building blocks of society. It's essentially saying our inclination to do these primal things, have sex, engage in business, have a sense of maybe greed to some degree, or aspiration comes from jealousy. If you don't have those inclinations, the world won't function properly.
Then why was that supposedly forbidden for them?
You know, it goes back to the question of free will, which would lead us down a different hole. And maybe there's a question of whether or not God actually did want us to eventually eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
He did knowledge of good
You're
and
asking
evil.
essentially an impossible question, which is kind of like one of those things. Why would God create evil in this world? Or why would God put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden if God knew that we were going to eat from it? So, you know, it's impossible to answer with a definitive answer, but I will just say evil or Ra, or this primal instinct, is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a healthy thing in moderate doses. But like David said, megalomania in healthy doses. All right, Dennis, where do we go from here? Oh, we don't have that much more time. No, yeah, we do. We got another 15 minutes.
I thought there were like 3 or 4 questions. I just want to think a little bit here. I thought there was, maybe not. Michael, did you have something? No.
If you look at it from,
go ahead.
if you look at it from the Kabbalah's point of view,
Can you just tell us a little bit about what Kabbalah is? David already got us started on the mystical thinking. But
David is beyond.
We're speaking in conversation with the group that might not know all the lingo that you're referring to.
Kabbalah is a mystical view of God, of the Godhead. God is understood by the mystics as being composed of 10 different aspects, attitudes, strengths and weaknesses. And it's the interplay between these strengths and weaknesses that are then allocated to us, and which we imitate in God, imitatio Deus, that give us our individuality, including Adam's individuality and Eve's individuality. David mentioned procreation before. The first command in the Bible, I think, is be fruitful and multiply. And I think we have to know that even before we know good and evil. And I think we need to understand that our job is to make more people. Our job is to make more children. Our job is to make more virtuous people, no matter what religion you follow. And the Zohar, which is the book of Jewish mysticism created in the 13th century, following Jewish tradition going back to at least the 5th century, tries to empower us to understand that the aspect of God that is strength, gevurah, and which also is judgment, is balanced by another attribute of God, which is chesed, loving kindness. And it's the balance of God's chesed and loving kindness, which we try to imitate. But it's not always equal in each of us. And just as it's not always equal in God, try to explain the Akedah as an example.
Akedah is the Genesis 22, the story of the binding of Isaac. Just trying to help.
Thank you. Thank you for stopping me. And it's this balance of loving kindness and judgment that comprises the major portion of our character development. And when it is out of balance, where judgment and strength, gevurah, overcome the loving kindness, that we get evil or we get sin, depending on how you want to word it. It's just semantics. And so the Jewish mystical tradition says that it is our job to balance these forces within ourselves. First, of course, you have to know that they exist, just as we are discussing the verbiage in Genesis 1, 3, whatever. You have to understand these balancing forces within yourself. And the more you know them, the more you know about yourself. And David is a perfect example. He's a shrink, a Jungian shrink of all things. And we need to understand ourselves. And the Bible gives us, and I don't care which translation it is, because eventually it comes to the same thing. The Bible gives us a roadmap for our own development, but we have the choice constantly of whether that's a good choice or an evil choice or a bad choice, and how we interact with other people. And I think that the two of you, Denis and Joshua, are doing a fine job of getting us there, but I think you're caught a little too much in the literal translation of the words, and you're not reaching us into what does that mean for you, Denis? What does it mean for you, Joshua? And bring us to follow you and your interpretation. We all can read the plain English, and we all have enough footnotes. And so bring us along with your feelings and your thinking, more perhaps than just translation.
I'm going to go there.
God bless.
Judith's got a question first. You have to unmute yourself, Judith. You got to press your space bar.
Yeah,
there you go.
I love Michael very much, but I'm going to make a non-mystical slant on the Garden of Eden story. If Adam and Eve had not eaten of the tree of knowledge, there wouldn't have been any human history. End of story. There wouldn't be any Bible. I mean, they would have stayed in the Garden of Eden. They wouldn't have had children. You know, end of story. It's exactly the idea that humanity is imbued with the need to make moral choices. And that's what now makes us human. And, you know, ethical decision making. And there's a mystical slant on that, I agree. But what I'm saying is that I think in some ways God knew this was going to happen, and in some ways He welcomed. It's the beginning of human history. You know, the exit from the Garden of Eden is the beginning of human history. And there's a beautiful poem about that, and I can't remember who wrote it, but the last line is, "Let history begin." You know, and
I'll give you another example to build on what you're saying. I'll give you another example to build on what you're saying, Judy. That whenever there's a crisis, a real moment of existentialism that we have in history, the Jewish tradition, there's always a major paradigm shift in the way that the world works.
Yeah.
So, you know, for example, some people see the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem as the worst thing that happened in Jewish history. But if it weren't for that, then Jews would still be worshiping in a temple in Jerusalem and sacrificing animals. In fact, it evolved Judaism so much that into the form of what it looks like today, that you got to see it as a blessing in many ways. So the crisis catapulted Judaism into this new form that was nothing but a blessing. And in fact, a lot of early Reformed Jews, they saw this holiday that we celebrate called Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temple. They refused to celebrate it because they said this was the greatest blessing of Jewish history, not the greatest curse. By the same token, the exit of the garden was necessary in order to create a paradigm shift for humanity. Now what I would also say is that we are quite in fact living in a paradigm shift right now as we speak. That is, everything that we know and how to do Jewish and how to do Christianity, whether it's in a synagogue or in a church or gathering in community, all those things necessitate transformation in the current world. Part of the reason why it's difficult to be a rabbi or it's difficult to be a minister right now is because everything that we know is essentially becoming obsolete as the world is transforming.
Wow.
And so just as Adam and Eve exited the garden, and you got to see it as a blessing, maybe not necessarily as a sin. What we're going through right now and the revolutions that are happening in religion or in organized religion, I think to a large degree, we're going to see the transformation of the way that we practice religion. You're going to see it as a blessing.
And that's one of the things that we've been trying to deal with, especially in the Episcopal Church, is how do we begin to see blessing out of what we're going through right now? Because everybody has been living in a state of fear and high anxiety, lots of depression. We can't gather as a society as we used to. How is God working in this context with us to maybe uncover another part of where this spiritual journey is for us? I mean, after 42 years of ministry, it's like, I didn't plan on this when I was first ordained 42 years ago. This is not what I signed up for. But yet, I'm called, even in this stage of my ministry, is what's God doing, and how can we see it not as a curse, but as a blessing? And Michael, it's kind of like getting to, when I look at this text, I'm not trying to look at it in a literal context, because for me, it's my struggle for a lust for power, my struggle for greed, my struggle of Adam and Eve is God really enough for me or not? Do I seek something else to replace that? And I think that's really where, for me in my Christian context, is really the struggle of everyday living. And I think that, for me, is where that story becomes important in our journey, and in the Christian context of, we're always looking for something more, and we're never satisfied when we get that more. So it ultimately comes down to the question of, as you know, she was a really crazy lady that was holed up in a church wall as an anchorite, Julian of Norwich. But she said over and over again, his love is enough. His love is enough. When anybody would come to her with a problem, she would say, God's love is enough. And I think that's the struggle, at least in our tradition, is God really enough for us or not? And I think in one way, that's the question that we're being forced to face in this pandemic era right now.
One of my questions that I always see when I look at the text of the Garden of Eden is, normally we kind of have this myth behind the Garden of Eden. If you take it literally, you say, no one knows where Eden is. If only we could find it, this archaeological place called Eden, and people are searching for it and trying to find clues in the geographic hints that are listed in Genesis 2. But really, going back to the idea that Eden means delight, and that returning to the garden isn't necessarily returning to a physical space, it's returning to a state of mind and a state of being. Eden means delight. There are moments that we experience in our lives where we feel like we are in the garden, returning to the most simplest form of who we are. You might say it's a place that's without sin.
Finding that original blessing.
Yeah, I like that better. The place of original blessing. Or you might say it's the place where you feel most godlike, free of the things that are man-made in the world. Just to give you an example of how I think the Bible gives us some hints of returning to the garden. If you think of what happens when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, what do they see when they're expelled from the garden? What's protecting the garden? Anyone remember? Maybe I'll just bring it up.
The spinning sword, the fiery
sword that is spinning around, that is protecting the garden. Now I want you to think of where else you see some kind of flaming fire that's present in a profound moment in the Bible.
Moses sees it.
Yes. So I'm going to bring that up right now, just so everyone knows what Michael is talking about. When Moses first encounters God, where does he encounter him?
Burning bush.
Now I want us to look at the language very carefully. So let me zoom in a little here. Moses is tending to the flock. Father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And an angel of God appeared to him in a blazing fire. And the interesting word is, in Hebrew, it's balabat esh. It doesn't mean blazing fire. It actually means, a lahab in Hebrew is a blade of fire. God appears to him, and there is a blade of fire. And he gazes at the bush, and the bush was aflame and not being consumed. What I'm going to suggest here is that Moses is having a moment where he knows exactly, maybe he doesn't know where he is, but he should know where he is. It could be anywhere, but Moses is at the entrance to where?
Eden.
To Eden. Yeah, Moses is in the transient state of being where he has a profound moment in his life, a moment where he experiences God, and he realizes, or maybe he doesn't realize, but we should be realizing as the reader, that Moses is standing in Eden. And I think we've got to recognize those moments in our lives as well. The question for us isn't seeing ourselves as a model of Adam, who's essentially the model of sin. It's actually seeing ourselves as a model of Adam in the garden, and the question that we should be having is, how do we get ourselves back there? How do we experience delight and original blessing in our lives in order to be transported into that spiritual state of being?
And in our Christian context, that would be akin to Pentecost, our form of Pentecost. They're in the upper room, and what appears over the heads of the disciples in the upper room is a flame. So that it's the Spirit that has alighted on them and has fired them up. And they're at that moment of next to the godliness. They're at that moment of delight. They're at that moment of original blessing. Now they understand what this is all about in the Christian context. And now they're able to go out and share the good news.
I think we're going to wrap up, but Michael, one more quick comment if you have one.
One question?
Actually, I have a question. If the first command is be fruitful and multiply, do you think that without the serpent, Adam and Eve would have been fruitful and multiplied? And what would the world have been like?
If the command was given before the snake appeared, one would say they'd have to be fruitful and multiply.
Yes.
It would be one hell of a large garden.
Good question.
David's going to go there.
No, a different question. Going back to the destructiveness of the temple as a blessing, the destructiveness of from creation, when the vessels were shattered, and we pick up all the little sparks and we put them back together in meaningful whole ways. And surely we have to fall apart a bit. We don't have to be polyfragmented, but in order to reboot ourselves anew, and when we become feeling obsolete, religious-wise, otherwise, the search for new meanings and new ways of having community, that's the prayer. But similarly, in physics, what validates physics but the bomb, the destructiveness that validates the principles of physics. But for Nachman, nothing is more whole than the broken heart, the falling apart and mending and reorganizing that we do continually. And we come back from the psychotic fragmented states every time we awake and leave the dream states. But going in out of fragmentation and reorganization, and the destructiveness is useful in that way, shakes us. We shouldn't be too complacent and too calcified. So
I know there are more questions out there, but I do want to say we are out of time. Dennis, I'm going to give you the last word if you want one.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Say thank you.
Silence is golden too.
I'm sorry?
I said silence is golden or whatever.
Sometimes. For me, this is really, in looking at it, for me, as a minister in Christianity, and a particular branch of Christianity, really the struggle of Anglicanism and Episcopalianism that we paid a price for is that if we're in a relationship with the divine, and if we're in that relationship, we're trying to experience love. And to say that God's love is enough for us, it means us, not just me in a plural sense, but all of humankind, that embrace has to go out to everyone.
Mhm.
And that's the difficulty, and that's the struggle of, I think, the original sin, putting that in quotes, is, am I willing to open myself up and be vulnerable enough to love everyone? Or am I going to encase myself and just say, yeah, God's love is just for me. But if God's love can embrace me for all of my foibles and idiosyncrasies, then God's love has got to be the same for everyone else. And that I cannot put a limit on that love. And that's the struggle, is how to allow God's unlimited love to be unlimited for everybody and not just for those that are like me. And
well, the two of you have taken some responsibility to be guides, spiritual guides for people like us. Is such an incredible job and so important. And I personally thank both of you. This is terrific.
thank you, Michael.
Take care.
I'll see you later, David. I'll make an appointment.
How about a beer?
That's you're talking. Yes, we'll all bend an elbow together.
Marjorie,
Yes.
real quick.
I want to say, oh,
Someone
man.
send us off with a blessing, please.
You want
Josh?
to bless us, or you want us to bless you?
Yes.
Let's go forth and love the day and
May the
something,
peace
yes.
of God, which is beyond all understanding, be upon each and every one of us. And may we bring the touch of God's shalom to all we encounter this day. Amen.
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 Sei gesund.
Achu.
Everybody, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom to all of you, my brothers and sisters. God bless. Bye-bye.
That was wonderful.
Thank you,
so much.
Josh.